By the time I finally understood what my life had quietly turned into, there was no one left who needed an explanation. The house had become still in a way that no longer felt temporary. It was not the kind of silence that comes from stepping out for a short while, or from children sleeping behind closed doors. This silence had weight. It stayed, even when I moved. It followed me from room to room, settling into corners, resting on furniture, waiting patiently for me to notice it. I remember one evening in particular, sitting on the edge of our bed with my shoes still on, the lights turned off, listening to the distant sound of traffic outside. In that moment, something unfolded inside me that could not be folded back again. I realized that everyone had always known my wife's name. They knew her sacrifices, her patience, her strength. They spoke of her with admiration and certainty. But no one had ever wondered what it cost me to make all of that possible. The feeling that rose in me then was not anger. It was not bitterness, and it was not jealousy. It was recognition. A slow, heavy recognition that my life had existed mostly as the background to someone else's story. And backgrounds, I learned too late, are rarely remembered once the story ends. People remember the face at the center of the frame, the voice that carried emotion, the hands that were visible doing the work. They do not remember what stood behind the camera, holding it steady, unseen, unnamed. Near the end of a life, memory does not arrive politely or in order. It comes in fragments, uninvited and uneven. I remember her standing in crowded rooms, smiling tiredly as people praised her for holding everything together. I remember myself hovering near doorways, near walls, always slightly outside the circle of attention. I remember the familiar ache in my hands from carrying bags, boxes, groceries, responsibilities, while compliments floated past me toward her like something carried by the wind. I remember how people spoke as if she had carried everything alone, not because they were cruel. Most of them were kind. But the version of our life they saw did not require my presence to make sense. Invisibility is not something that happens suddenly. It is not a single moment where the world decides to look away. It is built slowly, patiently, through repetition. Each unasked question becomes another layer. Each assumption becomes reinforcement. Each time someone praises one person without wondering who made that praise possible, another brick is laid. By the time you realize what is happening, the structure is complete, and you are already living inside it. If I had known earlier how quietly my life would end, I might have tried to occupy more space when I still had the chance. Or maybe I would not have known how. Some people are raised to believe their presence matters by default. They speak freely. They expect to be heard. Others are taught something different. We are taught to be useful, to be dependable, to make ourselves necessary. And somewhere along the way, we mistake that necessity for love. It took me most of my life to understand the difference, and understanding by itself does not undo decades of habit. I grew up in a home where consistency was treated as the highest form of virtue. My father worked the same job for decades. He left before sunrise and returned long after dark, moving through the house quietly, efficiently, as if noise itself were a form of indulgence. My mother kept everything running with discipline rather than warmth. Meals were on time. Clothes were clean. Bills were paid. When neighbors praised her strength, my father would nod from the edge of the room. He never stepped forward. No one ever asked him how he felt about that. No one needed to. This was simply how things were done. Love was duty. Presence was proof. Recognition was optional. I learned early that being reliable mattered more than being noticed. I learned that asking for attention looked dangerously close to weakness. I learned that if you did your part quietly, no one would question your value, even if they never acknowledged it. These lessons settled into me so deeply that I stopped recognizing them as lessons at all. They became instinct. When I met my wife, she already possessed something that drew people toward her without effort. She listened in a way that made others feel seen. She remembered names, details, small struggles people mentioned only once. She spoke carefully, even when she was tired, even when patience required effort. Being near her felt steady and safe, like standing in warmth after a long day in the cold. I did not mind that attention gathered around her. In fact, I admired it. I believed sincerely that standing beside that light was enough. We talked for hours in the beginning, about hopes, about family, about what kind of life we wanted to build. I noticed even then how easily people opened up to her. Waiters lingered at our table. Strangers shared stories. Friends leaned closer when she spoke. I listened more than I talked, content to let her lead the conversation. It felt natural. It felt right. We married young, before either of us fully understood the weight of the lives we were promising to build. Money was limited, but optimism was abundant. The future felt open, flexible, as if effort alone could shape it into something good. I accepted a job that offered stability without distinction. It was steady work, honest work, the kind that paid reliably but never attracted admiration. She worked alongside me for a short while, then stepped away when our first child arrived. People praised her decision immediately. They admired her willingness to put family first. They spoke about sacrifice as if it were visible only in her choices. I agreed with them fully. I meant it. What I did not understand then was that agreement does not protect you from disappearing. You can support something wholeheartedly and still vanish beneath it. Our days settled into routine faster than I expected. I woke early, careful not to disturb the house. I showered quickly, drank coffee standing at the counter, drove the same route to work every morning, watching the sky change color at the same intersections. My hours passed in predictable cycles of effort and fatigue. I returned home dependable and quiet, carrying the tiredness with me like a coat I never took off. She told me about the children, about their milestones and worries, about the small dramas of school and neighborhood life. I listened attentively. I asked questions. I nodded. I rarely spoke about my own days because they felt unremarkable by comparison. Nothing dramatic happened at work. No one praised me. No one asked how I felt. Over time, that silence stopped being a choice. It became habit. At gatherings, people naturally gathered around her. They asked how she managed everything, how she balanced emotional labor, caregiving, responsibility. They praised her strength, her patience, her generosity. I stood nearby, refilling glasses, holding coats, watching children wander in and out of rooms. Occasionally, someone would clap me on the shoulder and say I was lucky. I smiled, because smiling was easier than explaining something I had not yet learned to name. At first, the imbalance did not trouble me, or perhaps it did, but without language, discomfort settles into the body. I grew more tired than I expected to be. My shoulders ached constantly. Sleep became light and short. I told myself this was normal. Everyone was tired. Everyone sacrificed. This was adulthood. I did not know then that this was only the beginning. Her role grew larger over time, spreading outward from our home into the neighborhood, the school, the circle of friends, and eventually, the community. She volunteered at events, organized fundraisers, became the person everyone turned to when something went wrong. Her reputation as someone patient, capable, and selfless deepened. Her name carried weight, while mine narrowed into the background. Provider, driver, fixer, someone reliable who existed quietly in the spaces she illuminated. I performed my roles with diligence. I took pride in being necessary, though I knew fewer people saw the value in quiet presence. It is a strange weight to carry, the knowledge that you keep a structure standing while the world applauds someone else. At home, the dynamics of our household were subtle but constant. I cleaned up, maintained schedules, handled finances, and ensured that everything ran smoothly. She was busy giving herself outwardly, answering calls, listening to problems, attending meetings, offering guidance. And I supported her silently, often invisible to the larger world. Children came to her with their questions, fears, and excitements. They came to me with practical needs, requests for rides, money, or advice. This became natural, repeated for years, until I hardly recognized the shape of my own days. They were filled with invisible labor, steady, dependable, unnoticed, and yet essential. Evenings were the hardest. She returned from volunteering or community work exhausted, talking quietly about what had been accomplished, what still needed to be done. I listened, reassured her, took on tasks that would ease her load, all the while knowing that the world was unaware of the negotiations happening behind closed doors. The invisible compromises, the rearranged priorities, the emotional labor that never earned a mention. People praised her resilience without seeing the subtle ways she relied on me, or the ways I silently carried the framework of our lives. I remember feeling sometimes a quiet sting when someone asked her how she managed everything, and she answered modestly, without mention of my contributions. At first, I felt nothing more than a slight twinge of sadness. Over time, those twinges grew heavier, though I still had no words to voice them. Speaking up felt like arrogance. Claiming a share in the recognition felt wrong. So I remained quiet, as I had always been taught to do. And over the years, silence became habit. Habit became character, and character became an almost imperceptible shadow of myself. There were moments, of course, when I thought about speaking, not to claim credit, but to be seen. I thought of asking others to consider the full picture of our household, the hidden work, the weight I carried silently. But fear intervened. Fear of being misunderstood. Fear of appearing petty, resentful, or ungrateful. I convinced myself that love meant enduring without recognition, that usefulness alone was its own reward. And so I swallowed the words, as I had swallowed countless small frustrations over decades. Children grew. They learned, without being taught explicitly, who was central and who was a constant background presence. They sought their mother for counsel, for comfort, for understanding. They came to me when something required fixing or money, when practical support was needed. I did not mind. I accepted my place. I became steady, predictable, unchanging. Someone had to be that. It was safer that way. That was what I believed. As the years passed, people's admiration for her grew wider, more vocal. Neighborhoods, friends, acquaintances, they spoke of her with awe. They admired her generosity, her patience, her devotion to all who crossed her path. I stood at her side, as I always had, and felt a growing disconnect between the recognition she received and the quiet work I performed. I could not articulate it. There were no words for living as an invisible constant, while the world celebrated the light beside you. It was not resentment exactly. It was something more subtle, a deep understanding that one's life can exist fully and yet remain unseen. Even when she fell ill, the pattern did not change. People rallied around her, offering support, kindness, praise, and attention. I cared for her tirelessly, administering medications, managing schedules, making difficult decisions, all while the world applauded her courage and grace. In hospital waiting rooms and corridors, people would speak to me as if I were simply an extension of her illness. "How is she holding up?" they would ask. "Are you staying strong for her?" No one asked how I slept. No one asked how my own health or fear fared under years of silent labor. I carried that fear alone. I carried her care alone. And the world assumed that my role was either inconsequential or invisible. By the time our children were adults, the pattern had been fully established. She was the celebrated center, the admired figure whose accomplishments were public and remembered. I remained constant, reliable, yet unseen. My satisfaction came from the quiet knowledge that the household ran, the children were cared for, and she could accomplish the things she wanted to accomplish. That satisfaction was personal, intimate, private. It was mine alone, invisible to anyone else. The realization did not come suddenly. It emerged gradually, layered over decades. The quiet sacrifices, the invisible labor, the absence of recognition, they accumulated silently, like dust in corners of the house that no one notices until light falls just so. And I understood, finally, that this is what my life had become. a structure invisible in plain sight, carrying weight without acknowledgement, living quietly while the world applauded someone else. There is a strange grief in realizing your own invisibility while you are still alive. It is not loud. It does not demand attention. It does not break things dramatically. It seeps into the body. It sits quietly in your shoulders. It manifests in small aches, in light sleep, in the faint bitterness that appears uninvited. This grief is patient. It waits decades before it allows itself to be named. And yet through it all, I never stopped loving her. I never stopped supporting her. I never sought to undo her praise or diminish her accomplishments. I only carried my own story silently, tucked behind the brilliance she so naturally exuded, carrying the invisible weight of every unacknowledged effort that had built and maintained the life we shared. Even as her recognition expanded beyond our immediate circle, my world remained narrow and quietly contained. Neighbors praised her for organizing events and managing responsibilities. Friends complimented her thoughtfulness and patience, and colleagues marveled at her ability to balance work and family. I continued to be the reliable presence, the quiet hand keeping everything from falling apart. Yet no one asked about the cost of that reliability. I was like the foundation of a house, essential, unseen, taken for granted. My presence was assumed, invisible by default, and the world only noticed what rose above it. There were times when I thought about explaining my role, sharing the burdens I carried silently. But fear always intervened. Fear of being misunderstood. Fear that recognition would feel like boasting. Fear that I would appear resentful or small. And so I remained silent, as I had for decades, because it was easier to endure invisibility than risk confrontation or judgment. It was easier to support quietly than to demand acknowledgement. Over time, that silence became habitual, ingrained into the rhythm of my life. Our children observed this dynamic without ever fully understanding it. They sought their mother for emotional needs, for guidance, for affirmation, while they came to me when something needed fixing, paying, or arranging. I accepted this, believing that steadiness was my contribution, my role in the family. It was not glamorous, it was not praised, but it was necessary, and necessity felt like enough. Still, a quiet ache lingered inside me, a subtle realization that my own story had been folded into the background, almost completely unseen. Even at social events, her presence dominated conversations. People asked about her plans, her sacrifices, her insight, her ability to navigate the challenges of family and community life. Compliments followed her like a halo, and I observed from the margins. Occasionally, someone would glance at me, nod, smile, but never linger. My contributions were invisible, assumed, or simply overlooked. I learned to accept this, rationalizing that love required endurance and that being dependable without acknowledgement was a virtue. Yet the imbalance was palpable. Even within our home, I could feel the divide between her outward accomplishments and my quiet labor. She received attention effortlessly, while I moved through tasks that required meticulous effort, unnoticed. The repetition of this pattern formed invisible walls around me, walls constructed from years of deflection, habit, and quiet endurance. It was not resentment I felt, but a profound awareness of absence, of erasure, of invisibility. There were evenings when I questioned the fairness of it all, when the weight of unnoticed labor pressed upon me so heavily that I could not ignore it. And yet, I never allowed these feelings to surface in conversation. I did not want to burden her, to complicate her praise, to draw attention to myself. So I endured. I moved, spoke, acted, and cared quietly. My world contracted inward, and I became both observer and caretaker, supporting the life that everyone admired, but rarely understood in full. Through the years, I noticed subtle changes in our interactions. The gratitude I felt from small gestures became more personal, more internal. I no longer expected public acknowledgement. Instead, I drew quiet satisfaction from seeing the house function, the children thrive, and her accomplishments realized. My pride became private, my joy internal, and my frustration folded into the fabric of daily life, carefully managed, carefully hidden. When illness began to touch her life, this pattern persisted. People rallied, praising her strength, her resilience, her courage. I attended to her tirelessly, managing medications, coordinating care, organizing appointments. Friends and acquaintances offered support, but they always spoke to me as if I were merely an extension of her condition, rather than an individual bearing my own burdens. No one asked how I slept. No one asked if I was frightened. No one asked if I felt overwhelmed by decades of quiet labor and emotional labor that had gone unnoticed. The realization struck me, slowly and fully, during these times of caregiving. I understood that recognition in life is unevenly distributed, that some people receive praise effortlessly, while others, equally essential, remain invisible. It was a truth I had known intellectually, but now felt deeply, physically, emotionally. I had lived decades in service, support, and love, yet my contributions had been silently absorbed into the fabric of family life, never fully acknowledged or celebrated. And still, I did not resent her. I did not wish to diminish her achievements. I only wished, quietly, that someone had asked about me, that someone had noticed the constant effort, the invisible labor, the endurance required to make a shared life possible. That wish, unfulfilled, lingered in my chest, a quiet ache that never left but remained dormant, a companion of decades. Even as she continued to thrive, I remained a shadow, present yet overlooked, reliable yet unremarked upon. I began to understand more clearly with each passing year that invisibility is a deliberate construct, both imposed and self-chosen. By choosing to stand aside, to remain silent, to endure without complaint, I had allowed the world to see only her. And perhaps that was my choice, as much as it was fate. When retirement approached, the pattern did not change. She was celebrated for her years of service, her patience, her grace. Speeches were given, accolades shared, photographs taken, and I stood beside her, smiling, quietly maintaining the household, ensuring that every detail was in place for her to be praised. My satisfaction remained private, my pride internal, my contributions invisible. I realized then that my life had been shaped by a series of choices, some conscious, some unconscious. I had chosen silence, reliability, invisibility, believing it to be the noble path. Yet the consequences were undeniable. Decades of unacknowledged labor, a quiet erasure, a life largely invisible to the world. Still, I carried on, steady as always, sustaining the life that others celebrated without question. Even in reflection, I do not regret these choices. They were mine. They were the framework upon which our family was built. They were the silent scaffolding that allowed her brilliance to shine. And yet, in the quiet moments, the private hours, the ache of invisibility remains, a constant reminder of the cost of living unseen. After retirement, the rhythm of our lives shifted, though the fundamental dynamic remained. She continued to be sought after. Friends, family, neighbors, anyone in need of guidance or reassurance reached out to her. I stayed close, tending to details, ensuring her days flowed smoothly, meals were prepared, schedules adhered to, her home maintained. My world narrowed to the practical, the routine, the invisible labor that had defined me for decades. I moved through the day quietly, carrying the weight of experience without acknowledgement. The silence became more pronounced. Without work to structure my hours, time stretched long and empty, except for the obligations that still needed attention. Each morning I would rise, make coffee, check the house, repair what was worn or broken, run errands, answer calls that pertained to the household. She was busy elsewhere with visitors, phone calls, volunteer responsibilities. People admired her continued activity and generosity, but my presence remained assumed, unremarked upon. In the quiet, I felt a creeping awareness. The life I had quietly maintained, the decades of unacknowledged labor, had left me with only my own thoughts as company. Illness, inevitable with age, eventually touched her as well. When she became unwell, friends and neighbors rallied, praising her courage, her resilience, her grace under pressure. They did not question her strength. They simply assumed it. I became her caretaker, as I had been silent supporter for decades, managing medications, attending appointments, monitoring changes in her health, navigating the quiet crises that arose daily. People spoke to me as if I were an extension of her, not as a person with my own exhaustion, my own anxiety, my own grief. "How is she holding up?" they would ask. "Are you staying strong for her?" No one asked how I was. No one asked if the years of silent endurance had left me prepared for this moment. The days grew heavy with routine and quiet tension. The rhythm of care, of management, of constant vigilance left little room for reflection or acknowledgement. I observed her in the bed, fragile yet still proud, still determined to offer warmth and reassurance to anyone who called or visited. And I attended to her, moving quietly, efficiently, carrying both our histories and our present in each measured action. The life we had built together was visible to all through her presence, but the scaffolding, the support, the constant, remained mine alone. When she died, the world responded as it always had, with praise, stories, photographs, remembrances. People spoke of the space she left behind, the care she had given to so many, the patience and resilience that had marked her life. I stood at the edges of these conversations, nodding, thanking them, smiling, all the while carrying the full weight of the years in which I had labored silently beside her. Someone said, "She was everything," and I understood what they meant. I also understood the invisible labor that had allowed her to be everything to everyone. The days following her death were quiet, practical, and unremarkable to the outside world. Paperwork had to be handled, calls returned, funeral arrangements confirmed. Meals were eaten alone. I walked through rooms, touched familiar objects, each one carrying decades of memory and labor, now unshared. The house remained unchanged, but its purpose had shifted. Where once I had been the silent support, now I was merely present, moving through rooms without a role, carrying no responsibilities beyond my own survival. Grief did not arrive dramatically. It was patient, subtle, layered, and persistent. People checked in, offered condolences, spoke briefly, and then moved on, leaving me with silence that echoed my life's pattern. For decades I had supported, unseen. Now I was present, visible, yet utterly alone. The realization was stark and heavy. Recognition, attention, and acknowledgement do not arrive automatically with service or sacrifice. They are unevenly distributed, and sometimes not at all. In the quiet, I began to examine my life fully, without distraction. I saw the years spent quietly enabling, supporting, maintaining. I saw how often I had been invisible, how often my contributions had been assumed, how often my presence had been taken for granted. I recognized the truth I had long avoided, that a life of quiet endurance comes at the cost of visibility, at the cost of acknowledgement, at the cost of being seen as a person in your own right. Yet even in this recognition, I found neither regret nor anger toward her. She had not sought to overshadow me. She had not deliberately denied me recognition. She had lived fully, given fully, and the world had noticed her brilliance. I had only to live alongside it, to maintain, to endure, to love without demand. And so I did, and I had for decades quietly and faithfully. As weeks and months passed, the rhythm of my life settled into a new normal. I moved through routines alone. I walked familiar paths, repaired objects that no longer demanded attention, sat for long stretches in silence. I reflected on the life I had lived, the sacrifices I had made, the years of unacknowledged labor, and I began to understand, with a deep, almost painful clarity, that invisibility is both imposed and chosen. By stepping back, by not asserting myself, By enduring quietly, I had allowed my life to remain largely unseen, yet it had been fully lived, fully present, fully necessary. In this realization, there was no bitterness, only understanding. The house remained as it had been, filled with objects, memories, and echoes of the life we had shared. The world outside had recognized her. I had recognized her. And at last, I began to recognize myself, not as an extension of her presence, but as a full, flawed, enduring individual who had existed, supported, loved, and persevered quietly, patiently, and faithfully for decades. Time after her passing was measured less by hours than by the quiet stretches of reflection that settled over me. I moved through the house slowly, each room carrying decades of memory. The furniture, the objects, the small signs of life we had built together. All of it seemed unchanged, yet imbued with a new heaviness. I realized sharply that the structure we had created was now mine alone to inhabit. The rhythms that had once required coordination, care, and support were still present, but I was alone in maintaining them. Grief arrived without drama. It did not announce itself with tears or cries. Instead, it settled in layers, as subtle and persistent as dust. In its presence, I became acutely aware of every unspoken moment of my life. The years spent supporting without recognition, the quiet endurance, the invisible labor that had underpinned her brilliance. Visitors came occasionally, offered condolences, shared stories, praised her memory, and departed. Conversations ended once condolences were given. There was no ongoing engagement. My life, now more than ever, was unobserved. In these quiet moments, I began to analyze myself honestly. I examined the choices that had shaped my life, the decisions to remain silent, the acceptance of invisibility. I saw how admiration had always flowed toward her, and how easily I had redirected it. I saw how often I equated silence with strength, how my endurance had become a badge of quiet nobility in my own mind. I realized that I had mistaken endurance for acknowledgement, duty for love, reliability for presence. These realizations did not come with anger, only clarity. I practiced being seen in small ways. I spoke longer, allowed myself to express frustration, fatigue, and memories that had been kept private for decades. I sat with my own thoughts, recognized the weight of my contributions, and began to reclaim a sense of identity that had been largely absorbed into her visibility. It was a quiet reclamation, not dramatic, not loud, but deeply necessary. I allowed myself the dignity of acknowledgement without expecting it from others. Even as I moved through this period of reflection, I acknowledged the love that had remained constant throughout our lives. I had loved her deeply, without question, without reservation, and without expectation of recognition. That love had been sustaining, not only for her, but for the entire family. And yet, I recognize that living unseen comes at a cost. The cost is subtle, cumulative, and deeply human. The quiet ache of invisibility, the faint longing to be recognized, the internalization of unacknowledged labor. Looking back, I understood the full complexity of my existence. I had supported a life that was celebrated, while remaining largely invisible. I had carried responsibilities, made decisions, ensured stability, and preserved the structures upon which others thrived. And I had done so quietly, faithfully, and without demand. My satisfaction had been internal, my pride private, my endurance complete. As weeks turned to months, I came to terms with the unremarked presence of my life. I understood that recognition is not always granted fairly or evenly, that the world often notices the visible figure rather than the invisible scaffolding. But I also understood that a life of quiet endurance, lived fully and faithfully, has its own profound significance. The labor I carried, the love I offered, the patience I maintained, all of it mattered, even if no one outside our home ever acknowledged it. In the silence, I began to see myself clearly, not as a shadow beside her brilliance, but as a person whose quiet presence had been essential, whose unseen efforts had been integral, whose existence had mattered even without applause. There was no need to reclaim acknowledgement from the world. I reclaimed it for myself. This reclamation was subtle, internal, and lasting. It was the final lesson, the quiet triumph of a life lived faithfully, invisibly, and with unwavering commitment. I understood finally that invisibility does not erase impact. Endurance does not require recognition to have weight. And love, when fully given, persists quietly, shaping lives in ways that are not always visible, but remain deeply profound. I had lived long enough to witness this truth, and in doing so, I began to inhabit my own life fully for the first time. The days settled into a slow rhythm after her passing. Morning light would filter through the windows, landing on familiar objects, each carrying decades of memory. I moved deliberately, attending to the household with the same care I had for years. Yet now there was no one to witness, no one to acknowledge the quiet labor that kept the life we had built intact. The absence of expectation, the lack of audience, was strangely freeing and haunting at the same time. I realized that for decades I had lived in the interstitial space between presence and invisibility, and now I had finally arrived fully into solitude. Silence was no longer merely a backdrop. It became a companion, dense with reflection, memory, and unspoken truths. I walked through rooms we had shared, feeling the weight of our shared decades, the laughter, the small disputes, the nights of quiet exhaustion, the routines meticulously maintained. Everything remained, yet everything was tinged with absence. The air carried the ghost of her energy, the life we had built together, and the spaces that had been filled by her presence now demanded my attention entirely. In the quiet, I came to understand the full contours of my existence. I had supported, maintained, and loved without visibility or acclaim. My labor had been essential, even if unseen. My endurance had enabled the brilliance of another life to shine. And in that truth, I discovered a profound kind of peace. Recognition, I realized, is not always necessary for a life to hold meaning. The years of quiet work, the decades of invisible sacrifice, had shaped our world in ways no one could deny, even if no one had formally acknowledged them. Reflection brought clarity. I recognized the choices I had made, consciously and unconsciously, the decisions to step back, to endure silently, to allow others to take the spotlight. I saw how these choices had preserved the structures of our family, our household, and our shared life. I understood how they had shaped my children, subtly teaching them about responsibility, reliability, and love, even when unspoken. And I saw too that my love for her had never wavered, despite the absence of external acknowledgement. I learned to inhabit my own presence fully. I allowed myself to speak longer, to pause, to reflect without apology. I recognized my own importance, my own contributions, and my own enduring significance. I no longer measured my worth by visibility, applause, or recognition. Instead, I measured it by quiet persistence, by the integrity of care, by the depth of love and commitment I had maintained across decades. Even in solitude, there was companionship in memory and in the work of maintaining the household. Each act, each movement, each quiet attention to detail became a ritual, a testament to a life fully lived, even if largely unseen. I found pride in these small victories, in the meticulous care, in the persistence of stability and order. The absence of acknowledgement did not diminish their value. As time passed, I allowed myself to reflect without shame or regret. I acknowledged the quiet grief of invisibility, the slow accumulation of unnoticed labor, and the subtle cost of decades spent supporting someone else's brilliance. And yet I also recognized the unique beauty of a life lived fully in service, in love, and in commitment. There was meaning in quiet endurance, dignity in steadfastness, and significance in the invisible scaffolding that had held our world together. In the end, I understood that my life had been a story of quiet persistence, of unwavering commitment, and of love expressed through action rather than applause. I had lived not in the center of the spotlight, but in its margins, holding the framework that allowed brilliance to flourish. And in that understanding, I finally recognized myself fully, not as a shadow beside her light, but as a complete, enduring, and essential presence in my own right. If there is a final lesson to carry forward, it is simple. Lives of quiet endurance matter profoundly, even when unseen. Labor performed without recognition shapes worlds. Love given faithfully, without expectation of acknowledgement, endures and transforms. And in the quiet reflection that comes at the end of life, one can finally see oneself, not as invisible, not as secondary, but as fully, profoundly, undeniably present. I had spent decades living beside brilliance, supporting it, enabling it, and loving it. And now, in the silence, I could see the totality of my own life, the depth, the significance, the weight of every unseen act. I had existed fully, steadfastly, invisibly, and now I existed fully in recognition of myself. The story of my life, once hidden, was finally known to me.